Hey guys, tonight, we begin with the twisted theatrics of the Roman Colosseum. A place where fairness was optional, lions were hungry, and subtlety was thrown into the arena alongside prisoners. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Roman Colosseum was not designed for sportsmanship. It was designed for spectacle and also, possibly, as a way for emperors to avoid doing actual paperwork. Today, we have stadiums for soccer. The Romans had stadiums for chaos. If you walked into the Colosseum expecting fairness, you'd be about as disappointed as someone who brought a picnic to a thunderstorm. The crowd wasn't looking for balance. They weren't here to see who fought best. They were here to see who fell best, ideally in the most theatrical way possible. Bonus points for flailing arms and tragic facial expressions. Let's be honest, the Roman definition of entertainment was robust. A perfectly matched fight between two trained gladiators? Sure, that happened. But far more common were the opening acts. Criminals, captives, or very unlucky people who happened to owe the wrong senator money. These folks were given the equivalent of a sharp spoon and told to make it dramatic. And dramatic they made it. The Colosseum wasn't just a stadium. It was a form of civic therapy. Life in ancient Rome could be stressful. Plagues, grain shortages, and the occasional fire. Watching someone else have a really, really bad day in a controlled environment was how people coped.
And it was free.
Funded by the emperor, the games were a very public, please like me gesture. You got grain, a seat, and a view of someone running from an angry elephant. What more could you want? Even the architecture encouraged inequality. The emperor had the best seat. Senators got cushions. And everyone else got a stone bench and sunstroke. The actual people in the arena, they got an audience. So fairness was not exactly the design priority. This wasn't a fencing match. This was ancient Rome's version of dinner theater if your dinner included fried dormice and the play ended in screaming. Nothing says public service, quite like forcing an untrained civilian to fight a heavily armed professional in front of 50,000 strangers. The Romans had a word for this: entertainment. And while we have game shows and cooking competitions, they preferred something with slightly more risk and significantly fewer rules. Enter the gladiator versus amateur match, a charming tradition where a trained killer faced off against, say, a baker with a sword or a bureaucrat with an existential crisis. These weren't just one-off mistakes. These were planned. Sometimes the amateurs were volunteers. Sometimes they were condemned criminals. And sometimes they were just guys who really should have read the fine print. Gladiators, contrary to modern movie logic, weren't all enslaved nobodies. Some were volunteers, some were celebrities, and all of them were highly trained. They lived in schools, had coaches, and were basically professional athletes, except with more armor and fewer endorsement deals. Now, imagine pitting one of them against someone who learned sword fighting from watching shadows on a wall. The result was predictable, and that was the point. This wasn't about suspense. This was about spectacle. The audience didn't want a fair fight. They wanted to cheer for the obvious winner while pretending the other guy had a shot. It was the ancient Roman version of watching a squirrel try to drive a chariot. And for the amateur, well, they had options. Option 1. Survive long enough to be mildly impressive. Option 2. Survive long enough for the crowd to feel sorry for you. Option 3. Get hit so quickly and dramatically that the audience laughs and the emperor nods in approval. If you were particularly charming or dramatic, you might even earn a reprieve. Romans loved a good underdog story, especially if the underdog was bleeding just the right amount. But most of the time, the outcome was settled before the match began. The crowd knew it. The fighters knew it. Even the guy sweeping the sand probably knew it. Let's say you're accused of a crime in ancient Rome. Maybe you stole something. Maybe you looked at the emperor's statue a little too long. Maybe your neighbor just really doesn't like you. Congratulations. You now qualify for a special appearance in the Colosseum. And by special appearance, we mean you're going to be introduced to a lion, up close personally and probably without warning. The damnatio ad bestias, or condemnation to the beasts, was a Roman tradition that asked the important question, what if our justice system was also a zoo? It was Rome's solution to everything from theft to treason. Throw the accused into the arena, open a gate, cue the music, and the panic. The lions weren't ordinary cats either. They were imported, often from North Africa, and treated like star performers. They got better transportation than most citizens and sometimes better food. The prisoner, meanwhile, got a tunic and a vague sense of doom. No armor, no weapon. Occasionally, a stick, because nothing says fairness like handing someone a twig and telling them to make it look exciting. This wasn't a fight. It was a message. The Empire didn't just punish you, it made you part of the show. The more dramatic your final moments, the more the crowd cheered, the more the Emperor smiled, and the more everyone forgot their rent was overdue. And yes, people brought their children. Because why go to the Forum when you could teach your kids valuable life lessons like, don't commit fraud or you'll be lunch? Sometimes the condemned surprised everyone. They ran, they dodged, they climbed things. There's at least one account of a man playing dead so convincingly that the lion lost interest. Unfortunately, the crowd didn't. They made sure the show went on. If you're thinking this seems excessive, the Romans would have agreed. But only if you suggested not using lions. That would have ruined the aesthetic. By now, the Roman Colosseum had established a theme. Take something brutal and somehow make it weirder. But when they wanted to really impress the audience, they dipped into mythology. Because why simply execute someone when you could recreate a legend while doing it? This delightful tradition was known as fatal charades. Not a game, unfortunately, but a form of public execution that merged storytelling with creative sentencing. Picture a condemned man dressed as Icarus, strapped into fake wings, and pushed off a platform. No, he didn't fly. No, it wasn't subtle. The Romans loved mythology, gods, heroes, tragic endings. So instead of quietly dealing with criminals, they reimagined their deaths as performances. The audience wasn't just watching justice, they were watching art. Violent, state-funded art. Take the story of Prometheus, for instance. In myth, he's chained to a rock and has a certain recurring eagle problem. In the Colosseum, they skipped the rock and used stage props. But the eagle? That part was real. Or Orpheus, the tragic musician. The Roman version, a man in a tunic with a harp walks across the arena, and then someone quietly releases a few large, extremely uninterested animals. It didn't end with music. The crowd, of course, loved it. Finally, culture and entertainment all in one. You could feel refined for recognizing the myth, and still point and laugh when the guy in the Apollo wig tripped over his sandals. To be clear, these weren't plays. The performers weren't actors. They were people sentenced to death, now expected to help bring a story to life, before exiting it in the final act. No curtain call, just a well-timed nod from the Emperor, and a satisfied crowd who now felt a little more cultured. Just when you think the Colosseum couldn't get more extra, Rome said, what if we made it a lake?
Yes.
At various points in its early history, the Colosseum hosted mock naval battles called nomeikiai. Because when you've already turned executions into theater, the next logical step is to simulate a maritime war in a building that is very much not near the sea. Roman engineers, who clearly had both talent and too much time, figured out how to flood the arena floor. Not with symbolism, but with actual water. The kind that makes boats float and inexperienced sailors panic. The plan was simple. Fill the floor, toss in a few ships, and stage a battle with real people who are often less informed about rowing than the audience. Sometimes these mock battles reenacted famous sea clashes. Other times, it was just teams of captives told, row, fight, and try not to look like you've never seen an or before. The boats were smaller than real warships, but they were decked out with flags and very real weapons. It was less naval strategy and more floaty chaos with costumes. The audience watched from above like cruise passengers watching a buffet fire, equal parts confused and delighted. Nobody really cared about naval tactics. They wanted to see if someone fell off the boat in a dramatic way. Bonus points if they screamed something poetic while doing it. Eventually, the Colosseum stopped flooding itself for these shows. Probably because it turns out water and ancient concrete don't make the best long-term couple. But for a while, Romans got their sea battles, their splashing, and their laughs. Even if half the participants couldn't swim, and the other half couldn't steer. The arena floor was no ordinary stretch of sand. Beneath it lay a labyrinth of tunnels, cages, lifts, and pulleys, all carefully designed to ruin someone's afternoon. These mechanical marvels allowed stagehands to raise animals, props, or sometimes entire set pieces into the arena with unsettling theatrical timing. You're a gladiator mid-fight, sweating under the Roman sun. And just as you're about to win, boom, the floor opens and out comes a leopard. Not part of the match, just bonus content. This was not accidental. Roman event planners loved surprises. Why have a normal duel when you could turn it into an obstacle course with hidden lions? It wasn't just animals. Sometimes chariots would roll out. Sometimes fire pits. Sometimes large wooden constructs meant to represent a poorly made volcano. All of it designed to keep the crowd engaged and the participants deeply confused. You didn't just fight your opponent. You fought the floor, the props, and your growing suspicion that someone behind the scenes was laughing very hard. In the end, all the mismatches, trapdoors, weaponized myths, and political overtones served one purpose. Rome was addicted to spectacle. These weren't just shows. They were cultural events, political tools, and social glue for a civilization that desperately needed hobbies. The empire was big, complicated, and frequently on fire. But give the people a gladiator match, and suddenly, everything felt stable. The formula worked. Distract, dazzle, repeat. The Colosseum was the original social media feed, constant drama, where your public image could be defined by a single thumb gesture. But even the greatest empires get tired. Over time, the shows became less extravagant. By the time Rome began to crumble, even the Colosseum started to feel like yesterday's news. Still, its legacy lingered. Even today, we remember the Colosseum not as a sports arena, but as a monument to how far a society will go for a good show. It wasn't fair. It wasn't kind. But it was unforgettable. Because when you build a stage for 50,000 people and fill it with fire, iron, and politics, well, you're not aiming for subtlety. You're aiming for history.